Hi and welcome. The UN's annual climate summit, the Conference of Parties, or COP, begins at the end of this month in Dubai. On the agenda at COP28 are proposals to fast-track cuts to global emissions and establish funding for poorer nations hardest hit by climate change. Much of that discussion will also touch on the building sector. Building construction and building operations, such as heating and cooling, are responsible for more than 40% of global carbon emissions. I'm Stephanie Miller, Public Relations Director for HOK, and for the next 20 or 30 minutes, we're going to discuss COP28 and how it could influence the building sector. I'm joined by two colleagues. Anica Landreneau is HOK's firm-wide Director of Sustainability, and she'll represent the nonprofit design collective Architecture 2030 as a virtual delegate to COP28 later this month. Sean Quinn, is director of HOK's Regenerative Design Studio, which explores how the built environment can work in harmony with nature to help heal the planet. Anica and Sean, welcome. So we invite those of you who are watching to join the conversation as we're discussing the various topics. Put your questions, your comments in our chat, and we will get to as many of them as possible during the conversation, and then we'll follow up afterwards. But really, let's just dive in. Anica, please set the stage for us. When it comes to the building sector, what are, let's say, 2 or 3 issues you expect or hope to see addressed at COP?
One of the things that we do expect to see is some discussion around a standard or shared ideas around building codes and an attempt at standardization of language or nomenclature around zero emission or near zero emission buildings. And that's really exciting to me. Around 18, 19 years ago, when I moved to Washington, D.C., I worked for a climate policy think tank. And at the time, this discussion was really centered around supply side and not demand side. So we were looking at climate emissions through, agriculture and aviation and energy generation and, a lot of different sectors, but buildings weren't really at the table at the time. And so through the leadership of organizations like Architecture 2030, there's really been an understanding that we have to address emissions through the demand side. And so building codes are a really great place to start. However, we're not going to build our way out of this climate situation that we've created. We also have to address our existing building stock. So I hope to see a broader discussion around a building policy toolkit, something that addresses both new and existing buildings, something that builds consensus around tools that all countries can use, that addresses the emissions we already have that we have to chip away at. As I said, we're not going to build our way out of this. If your household suddenly had to go on a budget, the first thing you would do is sort of cut out the unnecessary expenditures, sort of trim the fat. And we know that in our existing cities, 50 to 75% of emissions often come from buildings. And so we really need to look at that as a huge opportunity to cut out those unnecessary carbon emissions. So let's address building performance transparency through benchmarking, accountability through building performance standards, decarbonization and resiliency through electrification, grid integration, refrigerants, energy storage and generation, embodied carbon through prioritization and investment in existing buildings, and material standards, and create a toolkit that any country could come and pull those policy tools off the shelf and start to address the building sector in their climate action plan.
And Sean, how about you? Same question. What key issues do you want to see addressed?
Yeah, I think I'll reinforce what sort of Anica said there about wanting to have better carbon mitigation and commitments, finding greater alignment across countries regarding the ways by which we advance these net zero energy goals for new buildings, existing buildings, as well as manufacturing, as well as full industry. How do we address all scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions across the board? But all of that mitigation still doesn't necessarily recognize one of the next things we hope to get reinforced here, which is how do we begin to develop nature positive initiatives? How are we not only mitigating the damage that we've been doing to the environment through development for the past 50 to 100 years, but actually how do we begin to start improving or reinforcing environmental health? How are we restoring brownfield conditions within cities to enhance soil health, deal with better water quality and quantity, which all enhances the air and allows for greater biodiversity. We live during an era where we're seeing great species loss, and it's the opportunity right now for us to really focus in and hone in on how do we actually reinforce that biodiversity expansion, which only creates better human health and well-being for the places where we all work. And so when both of those get done, I think the next big gaping question is that we're now dealing with major climate change issues. We're no longer trying to mitigate it. We're dealing with the realities of it. We're experiencing increased forest fires around the world, increased storm level events. So what are the resiliency measures that need to be taken around the world, whether you're in a water prone, drought prone, or in a poor economic situation, that begins to address not only the means to withstand some of those issues, but how do we ensure that those issues are being dealt with in an equitable fashion, meaning that both those that can afford those solutions as well as those that can't receive the access to those resilient measures.
Great. Well, let's move into a little more detail. Anica, one of Architecture 2030's priorities at this coming COP is to push decarbonization into, let's call it the next frontier, by leaning into nature and using landscape, urban planning, and infrastructure to reduce emissions. Can you unpack what that really means?
Yeah, over a third of the Paris Agreement was focused on nature-based or natural climate solutions. So, in short, we need more carbon sinks, right? We need more resiliency as well for communities that are already experiencing the worst impacts of climate change. And we know there's a lot of disparity, whether we're looking nation by nation or we're looking at neighborhood by neighborhood. The folks that are experiencing those worst impacts are often the ones least able to withstand them. And so we really need to look at ways of investing in deep green carbon sequestering landscapes like forests, even microforests or parks, wetlands, mangroves, bioswales, regreening our urban landscape as well as our edges, whether that's riverbanks, shorelines, and really helping us address both that carbon sequestration aspect and climate resiliency. There are co-benefits to that carbon sequestration and regreening and rewilding, as Sean just mentioned. That there's biodiversity, there's cleaner air, cleaner water. There's also heat island mitigation as the planet's temperatures increase. We know there's a lot of health stressors to that increased temperature. So adding more natural landscape helps bring that temperature down. Also, bringing down that ambient temperature can help reduce the stresses on our mechanical building systems, which helps reduce energy consumption. And I think overall, we have been undervaluing ecosystem services in our economy. And that's something that really needs to change if we're going to truly address the climate crisis.
Sean, that feels like the perfect opportunity for you to jump in.
I was going to say we've been innovating in gray infrastructure for the past century, and I think what we need to be looking back towards and moving forward is how do we rely on more green infrastructure solutions. So ecosystem services are all about how we enable the delivery of water systems, stormwater flows within our cities, not through deep concrete channels, but through reinforced ecological systems. And that means increasing our intelligence around the civil engineering processes to ensure the conveyance of those resources within cities that enable them to grow and expand with these sort of dynamic effects that we're feeling around climate change, changing weather patterns, as well as increased levels of temperature. The co-benefit that you find with that, right, is as we begin to sort of reinforce those ecological connections, we begin to find the ecological nodes that exist within cities. By reinforcing those connections, you then improve the ability to mitigate urban heat island effect. You improve air quality within cities for people, and you begin to stitch these biodiversity channels that can happen in cities. So where can we do that? The High Line in New York is a really great example of taking aged infrastructure and rewilding a very strong portion of the city by the renewal of that purely through the re-landscaping and rewilding of that infrastructure. But we don't need to fully rely on highways towards this. One of the best examples that we saw during the COVID pandemic was the new solution of looking at sort of slow streets within cities. And many cities have actually maintained that we have essentially primary streets that are needed as major arteries to flow through people in cars and vehicles. But these secondary streets could be more fully converted into fully landscaped systems. that could enable better overall tree planting that can both perform those ecosystem services, but also improve the overall quality of life in those environments. And so I think by looking more strategically at what parts of our urban infrastructure we can begin to decompose of its gray sort of concrete civic form and begin to integrate into it more living landscapes, we'll begin to see this healing process that has just a win-win benefit, both for our climate mitigation strategies, but also in improvements of urban quality and life.
You said one of the magic words, potentially concrete. Many of the carbon emissions that we talk about come from the manufacturing of building materials, concrete, steel, and other really carbon intensive building materials. Are there policies that you would like to see come out of this COP that are tied to materials and embodied carbon?
I mean, I think one of the first big steps, we've seen it here in California. There's now a new mandate to be doing embodied carbon analysis, otherwise known as life cycle assessment, on all large-scale building projects. That's something we hope to see get built into policies and codes within the building sector around the world. But beyond the policies that begin to start to create those sort of benchmarks, as well as then reduction targets, we need to see advances in the means of manufacturing of some of those major structural systems, concrete, steel, even the ways by which we manage timber going into building projects. There are great new technologies that we see coming out. A great company called Sublime Systems has been using electric arc furnaces for all of their cement kilns, being able to effectively reduce the embodied carbon of concrete by up to 90%. We're also beginning to look at biological materials by companies like Prometheus, being backed by Microsoft, that are actually looking at biological systems that can actually grow cement-like products. Investment in those solutions and being applied practically, being brought up to scale, and being evaluated for how those things can meet the same qualities and standards that we exist with now is going to be the roadmap by which we get from 2023 to 2050 towards totally carbon neutral or even carbon sequestering structures.
Well, and you mentioned finance and investment, and I wonder if either one or both of you could talk about kind of what does that role of finance and investment play? What's the business case to be made for decarbonization across the board, not only materials?
Well, there's a hot topic at the COP this year, which is the loss and damage fund, and I want to address that. There's been a lot of buzz about it. I know some of the maybe more developing countries are looking at it both with hope and trepidation. It's meant to address the climate impacts that these countries are already feeling, and for the highest emitting countries to pay into a fund to help them with adaptation, and I think also with their development, so that as they develop, they can do so in a clean and climate neutral or climate positive way. The UN just released a report that said developing countries adapting to climate change could cost as much as 200 to 400 billion every year for the next decade. Getting almost 200 countries to agree to pay into a fund that would equate to this much annually, I think is going to be very difficult. And right now they're looking at a voluntary pay-in, right? It's not going to be mandatory. And this is really about adaptation and, again, future emissions. It's not going to address the emissions from the countries, the highest emitting countries that have been emitting all this time. So I think that is going to help finance for those countries that are rapidly developing and that do need to adapt to climate change and want to develop in a way that is climate neutral and climate positive. But we still have to address the rest of the world that have been those behemoth emitters that have been emitting all of this carbon all of this time. And so that's a different scenario. And so we do see, like in the US, we had some incentive packages like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. They have started to move mountains of money to jumpstart green development. A lot of people weren't paying much attention to the IIJA, but there is a huge investment in electrification across the country and broadband. And so if you start to think about decarbonization of buildings, what do you need? You need an interactive grid, an interoperable grid. You need electric infrastructure so that buildings can start to talk to each other, that you can start to manage loads and how things, renewable energy and buildings and energy storage and demand reduction, demand response, all of those things, and vehicles speak to each other. And so getting that internet infrastructure and that electric utility infrastructure across this country was a really good first step. There were also some good climate justice investments in that incentive package. And then moving into the IRA, a lot of clean energy, a lot of energy efficiency, a lot of other incentives and building code incentives for both high efficiency and net zero building code adoption across the entire country. But I think we still need to see the financial institutions of the world and the private sector leverage alternative financing solutions in the countries that are high emitters. And if you're a publicly traded company and you're seeing that you have to worry about your climate disclosures, whether that's the SEC rule change in the United States or the EU taxonomy or other disclosures around the world, use that to leverage your influence, to influence manufacturing in every country, in every sector you do business. Address your Scope 3 emissions, but also leverage your real estate decisions. You ask every sector you're doing business in. You work up your supply chain, because I think we need people who have the money to leverage their influence to make change.
And you talked about infrastructure, and that can mean so many different things. But one of the things, Sean, that we were talking about just as we got on is the demand of electrification and the demand of everything from AI to electrification. Like, what are the impacts that that's going to have? And we talk about how great electrification is, but what are the downsides and what are the challenges from a green perspective?
Yeah, I'll break that down to like two parts, right? First off, where is the change in energy dynamics happening? Right. In many ways, we've been trying to figure out solutions by which we can reduce the energy intensity of our buildings, our cars and vehicles. But what we've been seeing as we've watched artificial intelligence grow, and we've seen computational design, but also computational processes in technology as well as in banking. We've seen the rise of data centers dramatically increase to the tune at which by 2025, a scant 13 months away, data centers will consume 25% of all the energy globally. And that's something that should really scare us, that while it's really wonderful for us to be able to have this conversation live with each other around the world, bringing in other folks, there's a natural toll to that. And so how do we begin to reinvestigate the way by which we, in the same way we move from CPUs to laptops, begin to consolidate and compress data centers, reduce their total energy loads, but also how do we start taking a better, more holistic approach to their resource flows? And so that's beginning to look at the means by which we take exhaust heat from data centers and use that back towards heating and cooling needs within cities. How do we draw from any water use and recapture that? Because it's fairly clean water leaving them to feed into irrigation canals, to re-daylight streams, to feed into agricultural processes. All of these things are possible, but they require us to think beyond the boundaries of our individual lots. So as Anica mentions here, looking at these sort of financial commitments, we need to start really looking at not only the large economic spenders that are consuming these resources, but how do we holistically in cities begin looking at the sharing of those resources dynamically. To your second part there of full electrification, we have the wonderful aspect that we're trying to use lower emitting power, but we have a scant ability to supply that power without directly reinforcing most of the infrastructure within cities. So we have to think very creatively, again, about those sort of power shed loads. How do we bring renewable energies much stronger and locally into cities? Because we can't simply rely on a super grid that's uniting the US or other countries around the world. We have to localize that energy generation by means by which we can reduce those peak loads to maintain total capacity of power without having to completely reinvent our civic infrastructure.
Right. Well, we've talked a lot about carbon reduction, And I wonder if we can pivot and talk a little bit about resiliency. And it was interesting, we did a quick poll on HOK's LinkedIn and asked our viewers what were the issues around the built environment that they thought were the most important to be addressed at COP, and resiliency was number one. And so I wonder, how do you think, or what would you like the leaders at COP to do to address all of these issues around resiliency, both the ones that are natural disaster and human related, and the others?
Put a price on carbon.
And
But no,
water and air quality.
I think that loss and damage fund is really critically important.
Mm-hmm.
The people around the globe that are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change didn't emit the carbon, right? Very little of it. Some of the least amounts. So I think it's really important to help them withstand the impacts. And also, they may be the ones to demonstrate how to develop in the most resilient way, in the most climate positive and resilient way. So let's give them a chance to be innovators and to lead and to demonstrate what's possible. I do think that those nature-based solutions that we talked about, putting a price on carbon sinks, people are spending a lot of money on, mechanical carbon sequestration technologies, on renewable energy generation, on very mechanical solutions. I think we need to really put a price tag on our ecosystem services, right, and put a price on carbon. We need to fully value not deforesting the planet, to maintaining the green coverage of the planet that we have, and to increasing that. So we also need to put value on whether it's oyster beds or mangroves or other shoreline restoration. We need to put a value on that.
Yeah, to kind of put it relatively simply, we need to shift from a point of reaction on the level of resilience to one of really, really proactive investment. It's an simplification of the finances, but 5 cents invested in resiliency efforts saves $1 in recovery. And that sounds like a very simple solution then, but resiliency efforts are very expensive. $1 billion might save $5 billion in recovery. But for investors and the public today, when we're starting to look at taxes, $1 billion is still a significant amount of money. Mm-hmm. So I think to Anica's point, we need to be more creative about how we're investing that money in those resources. It can't simply be towards reinforcing seawalls, sequestering carbon. It should be put towards things like ecosystem services that enable not only the mitigation of those systemic events, be they natural or man-made, but also how do we start enabling them to become places for public activity and ecosystem restoration. There are great examples of projects across the world. Cheongni-Cheong Canal, a really good one in Seoul, whereby they've relit in a centuries old canal. It hasn't only been able to deal better with systemic storm events, it will be able to handle sea level rise, but fundamentally, it's a park. And I think there are great examples from Houston to Washington, D.C., over to Dubai and Southeast Asia, where those public spaces can be used 90% of the year. And in those 10% of the time where you have that extreme event, it can be used to handle those resiliency needs. But fundamentally, it's an investment in, again, public spaces that can deal with those extreme events.
I'd like to say that resiliency is one of those areas where policies really lag behind. There's no codes or requirements in most communities that require people to take measures for resiliency. And so you see, insurance has been left holding the bag. They've gotten out of some markets. They're definitely looking at pulling out of others. And costs have gone up. Underwriters like FEMA are pulling out of other markets, and I think in other countries we're seeing similar activity. That is certainly, I think, spurring some communities to take another look at resiliency measures. One of the things we're doing is going through resiliency assessment with all of our clients and saying, what's the sort of bandwidth of risk that this site, this project might be exposed to, and then how do we right-size the risk mitigation measures, because we can't wait for a policy to dictate what we have to do. We can't wait for a guideline to be published. We really need to say what types of risks might we experience, what's the bandwidth of impact, and then what is the level of risk mitigation that we can take on. And most clients can't afford to go to the fullest extent, but we need to determine what's the right level of risk mitigation to incorporate, and what are some different strategies. And sometimes it's having a first level of a building that could flood every few years and bounce back really quickly, and putting critical infrastructure up a level or two. Is there a cost to that? Sure, but it's better than losing the entire facility because you didn't think about it, right? Or the entire facility going down and having discontinuity of operations, especially if it's a critical facility. So I don't know what the policy solution is to resiliency, but what we could say about any of this, whether it's decarbonization, whether it's resiliency, whether it's more equitable development, I think all of the nations participating in the COP need to model the best behavior. So they need to model what climate positive buildings look like. They need to model what resilient development looks like, what equitable development looks like. They need to show, first of all, they need to take the risks. They need to innovate. They need to reward innovation, and they need to model what the best solutions look like, so that they're sticking their necks out, so that the private sector and the public sector, that everyone can follow, right?
Well, a question that we didn't talk about beforehand, but one of the things that I'm really thinking of is advocacy and the role of the designer, whether you're an engineer, an architect, an urban planner, a landscape architect. What do you think is the role for the design community to be advocates, whether it's advocating for policy at that level or advocating with clients? Um, where does advocacy fit into this?
I mean, it needs to be comprehensive. I think as designers, our fundamental day-to-day job is solving the problems of our clients. And sometimes that's figuring out how to create a new office building to consolidate their people. And sometimes it's trying to figure out how to protect them from the upcoming hurricane in New York City. I think it's fundamental that we begin to unpack all of the holistic challenges that we face and begin to explore what are the ways by which we're going to be able to redefine city making through it. Our director of planning in New York, Bill Kenworthy's, published a wonderful study called New York City 2100, which really unpacks what does sea level rise look like in New York. And not only through the lens of here's how far it will go in its extreme events, but what are the ways by which that can create new identity and character for New York? How does it ensure the health and well-being of people that live in those areas? And then also, how does it, to the point of Anica's notion that this is expensive, but it's also going to create great value. And so I think we have a really important role to play, both in coming up with unique and compelling solutions to those problems. We have to explore the business case for them all, and we have to explore and understand the practicalities of implementing that. And that means understanding more about both the social, environmental, and economic challenges that we'll face in the next 50 years, but also how are we going to work with the policies in place? How do we advocate for updates in code? And how do we advocate with different policymakers or developers to implement those solutions, to pilot them at the first small scale, to prove its efficacy, and then scale that up, and then encourage greater communities and cities to adopt that wholesale.
Yeah. And I think we have an enormous role to play using our practical experience on projects, the work that we do every day, and advocating at the local level, advocating for changes in policy, changes in codes. It's folks like Ed Masria and Architecture 2030 who've been advocating for a long time to bring architects to the table in this climate discussion. The American Institute of Architects and our counterparts overseas like RIBA and other organizations around the world who have sent many delegates to the COP this year and last year. And we're not the only solution to climate change, but we're really excited to be at the table, to be a big part of it. And we testify at local, hearings about policy changes and code changes. We're on code development committees. We testify before Congress. We testify to get things like the IIJA and IRA, these big incentive packages passed, so that there is financing for some of these solutions. And I think we have a lot to say because we can bring our practical experience and saying this is possible, this can be done, this is how much we can accomplish, and really advocate for those changes and those advances in policy forward.
Well, that I think was the perfect unplanned wrap up to the conversation. Thank you both. This has been inspiring and engaging, and I encourage everyone, if you don't already follow Sean and Anica on LinkedIn, please do. And if you have questions or comments, please keep them in the chat. We'll try and respond to them after the fact, and then we will share this it'll be live as a video or available as a video when we're done. But thank you all for joining in, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Anica. Thank you, Stephanie, and everyone for listening.
Thank you, Sean and Stephanie.
Thanks.